On February 1st, 2025, something impossible happened in Bukele, El Salvador. No, wait, wrong country. Let me start over. Because what's happening right now in multiple American cities is following the exact same blueprint, and the implications are far more disturbing than anyone's willing to admit publicly. In the past 90 days, violent crime has dropped by staggering percentages in 3 major American cities. We're not talking about small statistical fluctuations. We're talking about 40, 50, even 60% reductions in shootings, carjackings, and homicides, numbers that seem too dramatic to be real. The mayors are celebrating. The media is running feel-good stories about community policing and violence interruption programs. The headlines claim that innovative approaches and community engagement are finally working, but behind those headlines is a reality that nobody wants to discuss openly. These cities didn't solve crime. They didn't address root causes. They didn't reform anything. What they did was far simpler and far more troubling. They cleared the streets using methods that would have sparked nationwide protests just 3 years ago. Methods that civil liberties organizations are quietly documenting but can't quite figure out how to publicly oppose. Because the results are undeniable. Crime is down, way down. And residents, exhausted by years of violence, aren't asking too many questions about how it happened. This is the story of American cities that chose order over liberty, safety over civil rights, and the uncomfortable truth about what happens when a population decides it's willing to trade almost anything for peace. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why what's happening in these 3 cities represents one of the most significant shifts in American policing in 50 years, and why it's spreading faster than anyone anticipated. Let's start with the city that went first and went hardest, because their results are so dramatic that other cities are now copying their playbook almost exactly. In November 2024, Memphis, Tennessee was experiencing a crisis. The city recorded its deadliest year in modern history. Over 340 homicides. Carjackings had become so common that residents were afraid to stop at traffic lights in certain neighborhoods. Gang violence was spiraling. Tourists were canceling conventions. Businesses were relocating to suburbs. The city had tried everything: community policing, violence interrupters, youth programs, summer jobs initiatives. None of it worked. Crime kept climbing. The political pressure became unbearable. Then, in early December, something changed. The mayor announced a new public safety initiative. More officers on the streets, they said, enhanced coordination between agencies, crackdown on repeat offenders, standard political language that usually means nothing. But this time was different. Within 2 weeks, violent crime began, dropping precipitously. By January, shootings were down 41% year over year. By February, carjackings had fallen 53%. By March, the homicide rate was on track to be cut nearly in half. How? What changed? Here's what the official press releases won't tell you. Memphis implemented what's being called a zero-tolerance zone strategy. They identified the neighborhoods with the highest crime rates, roughly 20% of the city generating 80% of violent crime. Then they flooded those areas with police. Not normal patrol presence, saturation, officers on every block, cameras on every corner, checkpoints at major intersections. Anyone in those zones after 10 p.m. gets stopped. Anyone driving through gets their plates run. Anyone standing on a corner gets questioned. The legal justification is thin, incredibly thin. Officers are using pretextual stops, finding minor violations to justify searches, broken taillights, expired tags, jaywalking, then escalating to officer safety searches that would normally be challenged in court. But here's what makes it work. They're not arresting everyone. They're doing something smarter. When officers find someone with a gun, with drugs, with an active warrant, they're offering a choice. Take this charge and go to jail or leave Memphis. Permanently. You heard that right. Leave the city. Hundreds of people, potentially over 1,000, have taken that deal. They sign agreements saying they'll relocate to other cities. In exchange, charges get reduced or dropped. It's not officially banishment because that would be unconstitutional. It's a voluntary relocation agreement in exchange for prosecutorial discretion. Where are these people going? Nobody's tracking it officially, but criminal justice researchers believe many are ending up in Birmingham, Little Rock, Nashville. The crime isn't being solved, it's being exported. But in Memphis, crime is down, dramatically. Residents in the targeted neighborhoods report feeling safer than they have in years. Store owners who were ready to close are staying open. Property values in those areas have actually started rising for the first time in a decade. The civil liberties implications are staggering. Constitutional scholars are appalled. The ACLU has filed preliminary complaints. But the political reality is that Memphis residents overwhelmingly support what's happening. A recent poll showed 78% approval for the new approach, including 64% approval from Black residents in the affected neighborhoods. That's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The people living with the crime, disproportionately poor and minority residents, are supporting aggressive police tactics that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, because they're the ones who suffered most from the violence, and they're the ones benefiting most from its reduction. Memphis created a blueprint, and other cities are watching very carefully. In January 2025, Jackson, Mississippi announced a public safety transformation initiative. The language was different. The approach was identical. Jackson's situation was even more desperate than Memphis. The city was approaching 200 homicides annually in a population of only 150,000, one of the highest per capita murder rates in America. The city had been nicknamed the murder capital in national media. Residents were fleeing. The tax base was collapsing. The new mayor, elected on a law and order platform, implemented the Memphis model within weeks of taking office. High crime zones, saturation policing, pretextual stops, and the same quiet offer to chronic offenders: leave or face maximum charges. The results came even faster than Memphis. Within 30 days, shootings dropped 47%. Carjackings fell 61%. The numbers were so dramatic that criminologists initially didn't believe them. They thought there must be reporting changes or statistical anomalies. But the crime actually dropped. You can see it in emergency room data. Gunshot admissions at Jackson's main trauma center fell by half. That's not a reporting change. That's real reduction in violence. How is Jackson's approach different? It's more aggressive. They're not just targeting individuals with active warrants or weapons charges. They're using gang databases to identify anyone with suspected gang affiliation and pressuring entire groups to relocate together. The gang database issue is particularly controversial. In Jackson, simply being identified in the database, even without charges or convictions, is enough to face enhanced scrutiny. Officers are explicitly instructed to make life inconvenient for database members. Stop them frequently, check their papers, inspect their vehicles, create enough hassle that leaving becomes attractive. One civil rights attorney described it as making the city uninhabitable for certain people without technically violating any single law. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual interaction might be legal, but the pattern amounts to harassment designed to force relocation, and it's working. Jackson estimates that between 500 and 800 people have left the city under pressure since January. For a city of 150,000, that's a significant population shift. The human cost is real. Families are being separated. People with jobs and apartments are being pressured to abandon everything. Longtime residents with deep community ties are being pushed out of their hometown, but the violence has dropped. And for Jackson residents who aren't being targeted, life has improved measurably. Parents let their kids play outside. People sit on porches again. The city feels different. The third city is the one that should concern everyone the most, because it's larger, wealthier, and the approach is more sophisticated. In February 2025, Oakland, California announced what they called the Community Safety Restoration Project. After years of surging crime, progressive leadership had finally lost patience with reform approaches that weren't producing results. Oakland's approach is the most legally defensible of the three. Instead of crude pressure to relocate, they're using a carrot and stick approach that's harder to challenge in court. The stick is aggressive enforcement, but instead of pretextual stops, Oakland is using data analytics to identify the roughly 300 individuals believed responsible for the majority of violent crime. Then they're building cases against them with unprecedented resources: multiple detectives per target, federal cooperation, RICO charges where applicable. The message is clear: we're coming for you, and we have unlimited resources to make your life hell legally. The carrot is the interesting part. Oakland is offering these same individuals fresh start packages, relocation assistance, job placement in other cities, even housing deposits, all paid for by a combination of public funds and private donations from businesses desperate to reduce crime. It's voluntary technically, but when the alternative is facing federal charges with mandatory minimums, the voluntariness is questionable. Dozens have already taken the deals. More are negotiating. Where are they going? Oakland's program actually tracks this. Most are relocating to Sacramento, Stockton, Fresno, and Bakersfield. California's inland cities are absorbing Oakland's crime problem. And in Oakland, shootings are down 38% in just 2 months. Carjackings down 44%. Property crime down 26%. The numbers are astonishing for such a short time frame. Progressive activists in Oakland are deeply conflicted. They spent years fighting for criminal justice reform, for alternatives to incarceration, for addressing root causes. Now they're watching a Democratic mayor essentially pay criminals to leave town, and it's working better than any reform ever did. The cognitive dissonance is visible in public meetings. Activists will denounce the program. Then residents from high-crime neighborhoods will stand up and beg the city to keep going. The politics are scrambled in ways that don't fit traditional left-right frameworks. But Oakland's model is the one likely to spread, because it's more defensible. They're not technically banishing anyone. They're offering resources to help people relocate voluntarily. The fact that the alternative is aggressive prosecution is just context. What connects all three cities is a fundamental shift in how America thinks about crime and civil liberties. For decades, the framework was that we should address root causes: poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, systemic racism. The idea was that crime is a symptom of deeper problems, and treating symptoms without addressing causes is futile. These cities have abandoned that framework. At least implicitly, they're saying we don't have decades to address root causes, we need crime down now. And if that means moving the problem somewhere else, so be it. The philosophical implications are profound. What they're doing is essentially a modern version of ancient banishment, a punishment that was common in Greek and Roman times, but abandoned by modern democracies as too harsh and arbitrary. Banishment doesn't reform anyone. It doesn't address why they committed crimes. It just moves them somewhere else where they'll likely continue committing crimes. It's the ultimate not-in-my-backyard solution. But politically, it's working, because voters care about their neighborhood being safe. They don't care as much about whether the person who was robbing cars is now robbing cars in a different city. That sounds cruel, but it's honest. The legal challenges are mounting. The ACLU has filed suit in Memphis. The Southern Poverty Law Center is investigating Jackson. Criminal justice reform groups are demanding federal intervention in Oakland. But the cases are complex because the programs are designed to skirt constitutional boundaries. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, but courts have given police wide latitude on pretextual stops. As long as there's a legitimate initial reason for the stop, what happens after is often upheld. The right to travel is constitutionally protected, but nobody's being legally barred from these cities. They're being offered incentives to leave voluntarily. That's different, legally. The Equal Protection Clause prohibits discrimination, but these programs are facially neutral. They target behavior, not identity. That the targets are disproportionately young black men is a disparate impact issue, which is harder to prove than intentional discrimination, so the legal challenges face uphill battles. Meanwhile, the programs continue and expand. Here's what's not being discussed openly, but everyone understands. These three cities are pilot programs. Dozens of other cities are watching closely. If the legal challenges fail, if crime stays down, if political support holds, this approach will spread nationwide within 2 years. Imagine this model in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, cities with large high-crime areas and exhausted populations desperate for relief. The political conditions are perfect for aggressive approaches that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The pendulum on criminal justice has swung back hard. In 2020, after George Floyd, the national conversation was about defunding police, about reform, about addressing systemic issues. Just 5 years later, cities are implementing approaches that look like tough-on-crime policies from the 1990s, but more sophisticated. What changed? Crime surged in many cities during the pandemic and after. Reform prosecutors reduced charges and bail requirements. Many offenders cycled through the system repeatedly without consequences. The public, including many in minority communities who initially supported reform, lost patience. Progressive prosecutors in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities were recalled or lost re-election. Voters explicitly rejected continued reform approaches. The message was clear. We tried your way. Crime went up. Now we're trying something else. That something else is what we're seeing in Memphis, Jackson, and Oakland. And the early results are giving political cover to go even further. But here's what should terrify anyone who cares about civil liberties. None of these programs have sunset clauses. None have oversight mechanisms. None have metrics for when they'll end. Once you give government the power to pressure people to leave cities, to saturate neighborhoods with police, to treat entire populations as suspect, that power rarely gets voluntarily returned. The Patriot Act was supposed to be temporary. It's still here. Stop and frisk was supposed to be targeted. It became routine harassment of hundreds of thousands. These crime reduction programs will follow the same trajectory. What starts as emergency measures in crisis situations becomes permanent features of how policing works. The disparate impact is undeniable. These programs overwhelmingly target young black men. The official justification is that crime data shows that's where violence is concentrated. But the result is that being a young black man in certain neighborhoods now means constant police interaction. regardless of your individual behavior. If you're in the database, even without charges, you're treated as suspect. If you're in a high crime zone after curfew, you're stopped. If you're standing on a corner, you're questioned. The presumption of innocence has been replaced with presumption of guilt that you must constantly disprove. For residents of these neighborhoods who aren't involved in crime, this is exhausting and degrading. You're collateral damage in a strategy targeting your neighbors. You benefit from reduced violence, but you pay for it with constant suspicion and harassment. The long-term consequences are unpredictable. Where are these relocated people going? What happens in the cities absorbing them? Does crime simply shift geographically without actually decreasing? Are we just playing whack-a-mole with violence? Initial data suggests exactly that. Birmingham has seen a spike in certain crime categories matching Memphis's timeline. Little Rock is experiencing increased gang activity. The cities receiving relocated offenders aren't prepared for the influx and don't have the resources to manage it. So the problem isn't being solved, it's being moved. Concentrated in cities that are poorer, blacker, and less politically powerful than the ones implementing these programs. Memphis, Jackson, and Oakland are exporting their crime problems to places with less capacity to resist. This creates a perverse incentive structure. If your city can afford aggressive policing and relocation programs, you can push crime elsewhere. If your city can't, you become the dumping ground. Inequality compounds. The international comparison is unavoidable. What El Salvador did under Bukele, arresting tens of thousands on minimal evidence and holding them in mass detention, produced dramatic crime reductions, but at the cost of due process, human rights, and any pretense of liberal democracy. The American approach is more subtle. We're not building mega prisons, we're not suspending habeas corpus, but we're achieving similar results through mass pressure, strategic prosecution, and paid relocation. It's softer authoritarianism, but the direction is the same, and the public support is there. When people are afraid to leave their homes, when children are caught in crossfire, when businesses close due to violence, civil liberties arguments lose political power. Safety becomes the overwhelming priority that justifies almost any means. That's the calculation these cities are making. We can debate rights and reform, or we can reduce violence now using methods that work, even if they're troubling. The political pressure to choose the latter is overwhelming. What happens next depends on the legal challenges and the sustainability of the results. If courts shut down these programs, cities will need to find different approaches. If crime stays down, expect rapid expansion to dozens more cities within a year. But even if courts intervene, the genie is out of the bottle. The public has seen that aggressive, legally questionable tactics can produce rapid crime reductions. That knowledge changes the political landscape permanently. Future mayors will face pressure to implement similar programs whenever crime spikes. The Memphis model will become the default response to urban violence, refined and adapted, but fundamentally the same. Saturation policing, pressure to relocate, export the problem. The America this creates is one where freedom of movement depends on your criminal record, real or suspected, where entire neighborhoods exist under quasi-permanent police occupation, where cities compete to push their problems onto weaker neighbors. It's not the America of constitutional ideals, but it might be the America that exhausted urban populations actually want. That's the most disturbing realization of all, because these programs are popular, not with activists or academics or civil libertarians, but with the actual residents of high-crime neighborhoods who have suffered through years of violence while reformers debated root causes and systemic solutions. Those residents are saying, we don't care about your constitutional concerns. We want to feel safe. We want our kids to play outside. We want to run errands without fear. If aggressive policing and questionable relocations achieve that, we support it. That democratic legitimacy, the support of the affected communities themselves, is what makes opposing these programs so difficult. How do you tell people suffering from violence that your civil liberties concerns outweigh their safety, especially when the reforms you supported didn't reduce crime? That's the impossible position progressive activists find themselves in. They're intellectually opposed to these tactics, but can't offer alternatives that work as quickly or as well. So they're losing the political argument, not because their concerns are wrong, but because they don't have better solutions. What's happening in Memphis, Jackson, and Oakland is a preview of American policing's future, more aggressive, more willing to bend constitutional norms, more focused on results than process, and more supported by minority communities than activists want to admit. The crime has dropped. The methods are troubling. The long-term consequences are unknown, but the immediate political incentives favor expansion, not reversal. If this investigation revealed something you weren't hearing in mainstream coverage, There's far more happening across America's cities than most people realize. The choices being made right now about safety versus liberty will define urban life for the next generation, and most people don't even know the debate is happening.